The meteorite fell into the Pacific Ocean at dawn on Tuesday, raising a column of water as high as Everest and turning the sky into a gray veil of oblivion. The tsunami wave circled the planet twice. Coastal cities disappeared in minutes, leaving behind silent ruins and millions of dead. Dust rose into the stratosphere in a cloud larger than a continent. Particles of sulfur and ash began their slow journey through the air currents. A week later, the sun became a dim spot behind a gray veil. Light reached the earth as a faint echo of what once gave life and warmth. The temperature began to drop by 1 degree every day. Thermometers in Africa showed 0, in Europe -20, in Siberia -50. The harvest died in the fields within a month. Plants blackened and withered without light, turning into fragile statues of their own demise on the frozen ground. Animals moved towards the equator in an instinctive flow. Herds of ungulates, flocks of birds, lone predators, all seeking warmth that was nowhere to be found. 1 billion people died in the first winter. Cold, hunger, and disease wiped out the weak, the old, the sick, those who did not have time or were unable to adapt. Governments fell one after another. When there is nothing to feed the people, power becomes an abstraction that cannot be eaten or burned for warmth. Cities turned into tombs of glass and concrete. Skyscrapers stood as empty monuments to a civilization that had forgotten that nature is stronger than architecture. The survivors went underground. Old mines, subways, bunkers, basements, anything that could shelter them from the frosty wind and preserve what little heat remained. Engineers built the first underground farms in abandoned subway tunnels. LED lamps replaced the sun, hydroponics replaced soil and rain. Lettuce grew under purple light in the London Underground. The leaves stretched towards the artificial light like a prayer to a god who no longer answered. In the mines of the Appalachians, mushrooms were grown on sawdust and compost. White caps covered long racks, the only harvest in a world without sun. Scientists in a bunker beneath the Swiss Alps worked on a project of light domes, huge structures of glass and steel for greenhouse cities. The first dome was erected over the remains of Zurich in 2 years. Thousands of workers labored in masks, protecting themselves from the air, which had become poisonous from the ash. Under the dome, the temperature remained at +15 degrees, an artificial summer in an ocean of eternal winter, an island of life in a frozen world of the dead. Trees rescued from botanical gardens were planted along the new streets. Their roots went into imported soil, as precious as gold or memories. The dome's population was strictly controlled. 1 million people, no more, the life support system working at the limits of technology and hope. Outside the dome's walls, millions froze in tent camps. Fires made from furniture and books warmed the nights, while during the day people stormed the gates unsuccessfully and desperately. The guards fired over their heads, then at their legs, then at their chests. The choice between compassion and survival was decided in favor of the latter every time. Other domes were built over Singapore, Dubai, and the remains of Sydney. An archipelago of artificial oases in a desert of ice and an ash-colored sky overhead. Underground tunnels stretched between the domes. Trains carried goods, technology, genetic material, an exchange that had kept humanity afloat in recent years. Oxygen became a problem in the 5th year. The planet's forests died, the ocean froze, phytoplankton disappeared, the Earth's lungs stopped breathing forever. Oxygen generators operated in each dome. Water electrolysis converted precious moisture into air that could be breathed for another day or two. But more and more energy was needed. Reactors were overloaded, solar panels did not work without the sun, and fuel reserves were melting faster than hopes for the future. Scientists proposed growing algae in huge vats. The green mass of spirulina produced oxygen and protein, solving 2 problems at once. The first algae farm began operating under the dome of Tokyo. The vats took up an entire block. The smell was terrible, but people breathed and ate the simultaneous solution. The population fed on spirulina and mushroom tablets. The taste was forgotten after a year. Food became a function, fuel for the body, not a source of joy. Children born under the domes did not know the taste of apples. They grew pale and thin, their lungs weaker than those of their parents who had seen the sun. The elderly told stories of blue skies and yellow suns. Young people listened to these stories as if they were fairy tales about dragons. Beautiful, but impossible to believe. Artists painted landscapes from memory on the walls of the tunnels. Green fields, blue seas, sunrises, a museum of a world that no longer existed anywhere. Musicians played old songs about summer and rain. The melodies echoed through the corridors, reminding them of a time when music was about love, not loss. In the 10th year, conflicts over resources began. The Singapore Dome cut off water supplies to the Bangkok Dome, demanding air purification technology and concessions in return. Diplomats tried to negotiate, but words were shattered by the reality of scarcity. When air runs out, negotiations turn into bargaining for hours of life. The first war for oxygen broke out between the domes of Cairo and Alexandria. Artillery pounded the glass walls, depressurization killing thousands instantly. Shards of domes fell like snow on the frozen ground. People suffocated in the streets, clutching their throats, their eyes filled with the horror of their last breath. There were no winners. Both domes lost their airtightness. Both populations died within a day, leaving behind only ruins and a lesson that no one learned. The Dome Council convened in emergency session. Representatives of 40 surviving greenhouse cities tried to agree on disarmament and cooperation, the last and necessary step. The decision was made by a majority vote to create a unified system of resource distribution, centralized management, a planetary government born of necessity and the shadows. Nationalists in the Moscow Dome staged a riot. They demanded independence, shouted about sovereignty, but the guards suppressed the uprising with tear gas and force. The gas in the enclosed space killed 200 people. Their bodies lay in the corridors for 3 days, while the systems worked to clean the air of toxins and the smell of corpses. After that, talk of independence subsided. The fear of death by suffocation proved stronger than ideologies that had previously seemed more important than one's own life and air. The unified government introduced a card system for oxygen. Each person was allowed 16 hours of full breathing per day, the rest, masks with filters. People learned to sleep in masks. During sleep, the body consumed less oxygen, and the savings allowed more air to be allocated for work and wakefulness. Workers on algae farms received extra hours. Their labor was considered critical. Without them, the cities would suffocate in a week at most. A black market for oxygen tanks flourished in the tunnels. Smugglers sold air at the price of gold, and people gave their last for the chance to breathe deeply. The police fought smuggling ruthlessly. Those caught were deprived of their oxygen rations for a week, and most did not survive their punishment in unventilated cells. In the 15th year, the domes began to physically unite. Huge glass corridors were built between cities, creating a network of islands of life under the gray sky. The journey from Zurich to Paris took 2 days by train. Passengers looked out the windows at a dead world, frozen forests, ghost towns covered in snow. Archaeologists explored the old world in protective suits. They found things belonging to people of the past: telephones, books, toys, artifacts of a civilization destroyed by the sky. Museums under domes stored these finds. Children came to look at sunglasses and did not understand their purpose, because there had been no sun for 20 years. Scientists tried to clean the atmosphere. They launched drones with chemical reagents, built giant filters, and hoped to accelerate the settling of dust and ash in thousands of ways. Calculations showed that natural purification would take 300 years. With technology, 200, provided that the systems did not fail before the end. No one expected to live to see the blue sky. It was a job for their descendants, a legacy of hope, a bequest from a dead civilization to one yet to be born. Geneticists worked on new plant varieties, species capable of growing with minimal light, withstanding the cold, and producing maximum oxygen with minimal effort from nature. The first successes came in the 20th year. Moss that could grow on the walls of tunnels without lamps, feeding only on moisture and carbon dioxide from respiration. Green walls covered kilometers of corridors. The air became cleaner, humidity rose, people breathed easier, a small victory in a long war with the planet. Religions transformed under the domes. The old gods of the heavens lost their meaning. New cults worshipped air, water, light, the elements of survival and simple faith. Priests of the new Church of Oxygen performed rituals at the generators. Prayers sounded like operating instructions, liturgies like technical documentation for the life support system. But people needed faith in something greater than machines. They prayed because hope is also a kind of fuel that allows you to move forward in the darkness. In the 25th year, the population stabilized at 50 million. All who had survived, all whom the system could feed under the domes of eternal winter. The birth rate was strictly controlled. A license for a child was issued by lottery, 1 child for every 20 families, and genetic diversity was maintained centrally and scientifically. Children grew up in children's centers. Education, nutrition, upbringing, everything was collective. Families saw each other on a schedule, and love was rationed like oxygen and water. The dome generation was different. They did not long for the sun because they did not remember it. Their dreams were of clean air, not blue skies. The engineers of this generation made a breakthrough. They created a new type of bioreactor where bacteria produced oxygen 10 times more efficiently than algae and plants combined. The first bioreactor was launched under the dome of Berlin, a huge steel cylinder as tall as a cathedral, inside which life bubbled at the molecular level, invisible and life-saving. The air became cleaner within a year. Oxygen levels increased to 20 hours a day. Masks were worn only at night, and people remembered the feeling of breathing deeply. Hope returned like spring after a long winter. If they could solve the air problem, then they could bring back the sky, the sun, and peace. In the 30th year, the sky began to brighten. The dust slowly settled, layer by layer, millimeter by millimeter, patiently restoring the planet's lost face. The sun became visible as a dim spot through the clouds. Not enough for warmth, but enough for hope that someday it would be yellow and bright again. The temperature began to rise, -30 instead of -40, a small change that meant that the worst was behind them, that the coldest time had finally passed. Scientists launched the Green Earth project. They planned to plant billions of trees under temporary domes, create new forests, and give the planet back its lungs of foliage. The first seedlings were planted in the valley where Yellowstone Park used to be. Pine trees, genetically modified for cold weather, resistant to ash in the soil and air. The trees grew slowly, but they grew. After 10 years, they reached a height of 1 meter. After 20, 5 meters, their green needles stretching stubbornly toward the gray sky. The children of the dome dwellers saw a real forest for the first time. They walked among the trees in protective suits, touched the bark, and cried for reasons they couldn't explain in words. In the 50th year, the domes began to be dismantled. The atmosphere had cleared enough, the temperature had risen to -10, and it was possible to breathe without masks for a short time. The Reykjavik dome was the first to be opened. Glass sections were lifted hydraulically, letting in fresh wind, cold, prickly, but real air from the living planet. People stood in the square and looked up, the grey sky above their heads, but not glass, not a barrier, but the real sky, infinite and free above the crowd. Some cried, some laughed, some prayed. Emotions mingled in a single stream of liberation from half a century of claustrophobia under the artificial ceilings of a closed world. Cities began to grow upward again. New buildings were constructed with the cold in mind, with thick walls and triple glazing. But outside, under the open sky, even if it was grey, roads were built between cities. Caravans of all-terrain vehicles carried goods, people, and hope, connecting islands of civilization into an archipelago, then into a continent of gradual recovery. Old cities remained under the snow: New York, Tokyo, London, ghosts of megacities where millions froze in the early years of the terrible and inevitable catastrophe. Archaeological expeditions explored the ruins. They documented the last days of the old world, finding diaries, photographs, and messages from those who did not survive long enough. The Museum of Catastrophe was built in Geneva, a giant building made of dark glass. Inside, the story of the fall and recovery, so that people would remember, so that they would never forget. Children studied the history of the ash-filled sky in schools. They had to understand the fragility of the world, our dependence on nature, the importance of technology and cooperation for survival. In the 70th year, the first ray of direct sunlight broke through the clouds. Bright, yellow, warm, it touched the ground in the Andes, and people knelt down in delight. A photograph of this moment spread throughout all cities. The golden ray against the backdrop of grey mountains became a symbol of rebirth, a promise that the worst was truly behind us forever. The temperature reached zero at the equator. The snow began to melt, exposing the earth, rocks, and roots of dead trees, the skeleton of the planet, which would begin to grow flesh and life. The oceans began to thaw. Cracks in the ice spread like a web. Water flowed again. Currents came back to life. Salt and cold mixed in planetary motion. The first signs of life in the ocean were discovered by accident. Bacteria that had survived under the ice crust began to multiply, feeding on minerals and light penetrating through the water. Biologists spoke of an evolutionary miracle. Life had found a way, even through a catastrophe that seemed to spell the absolute end of all life on the cold planet. In the 80th year, the first plants were planted in open ground without protection, modified grass capable of growing at -5 degrees and with almost no light. Green shoots broke through the melted snow, fragile, stubborn, alive. The first greenery on the Earth's surface in 80 years of winter and eternal ash. Farmers returned to the fields. They sowed new varieties of wheat, barley, and potatoes, adapted to the new world, to the cold that would now remain forever. The harvests were modest, but they were harvests. Ears of grain swayed in the wind under a grey sky, and people baked bread from real grain for the first time in their lives. The taste of the bread seemed miraculous. It was coarse, heavy, sour, but it was bread from the earth, not a tablet made from algae under artificial lights. Animals were returned from genetic banks. Cows, sheep, chickens, stored as embryos in liquid nitrogen, were now being born into a new world in their old form. The first calf was born on a farm in New Zealand. It staggered on thin legs, mooed weakly, but it was alive, warm, real, not born from a test tube. Children looked at the animals with delight. They knew them only from pictures, but now they could pet them, hear them, feel that life was richer than algae and fungi. In the 90th year, the sky turned light gray. The ash had almost all settled, leaving a thin haze that made the sun pale but visible every day now. Astronomers recorded the first star visible to the naked eye. Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, broke through the veil, a sign that space still existed out there. People gathered in the evenings to look at the sky. They searched for stars, showed them to their children, and talked about constellations that no one had seen for almost 100 years. Culture was slowly reviving. Musicians wrote symphonies about ashes and rebirth. Artists painted landscapes of the new world. Poets sang of the persistence of life against death. Books were being published again. Not only technical literature, but novels, poetry, philosophy. People remembered that they lived not only with their bodies, but also with their souls. Theaters opened in new cities. Old plays and new dramas about catastrophe, survival, and love in a world where air was more precious than gold were performed on stage. In the 100th year, the temperature reached +5 at the equator. It was the middle of a new summer, short and cool, but a summer when the snow melted completely for a couple of months. The first summer holiday was celebrated across the planet. Millions of people took to the streets, danced, sang, and rejoiced in the warmth, which was modest but was real warmth from the sun. Children bathed in streams of meltwater. They cried out from the cold, but they laughed because it was free water flowing across the land, not from pipes under domes. Forests grew faster. Trees covered the slopes of mountains, valleys, plains. The green cover returned to the planet its garment, stolen by ashes almost a century ago. The birds returned. First the crows, then the sparrows, then the birds of prey. They flew in from the south, where they had survived under temporary domes in genetic reserves. The birdsong became a sensation. People stopped in the streets, listened to the trills, recorded them, and cried because the sound of wildlife had been completely forgotten by generations. In the 120th year, the sky turned blue for one day. The wind dispersed the last clouds of ash, and for the first time in a century, people saw a clear and deep blue. This day was declared a planetary holiday. Blue Sky Day became the most important day in the calendar, a day of remembrance, gratitude, and hope for a bright and warm future. The elderly, who remembered the old world, wept and died peacefully. They had seen the return of the blue sky, their mission was accomplished, and the baton had been passed on to the young and capable. The young built a new world. Cities grew according to ecological principles. Technology served nature rather than dominating it. The lesson had been learned painfully. Solar panels covered the roofs. The energy of the sun, which had finally returned, powered a civilization that vowed never again to burn the planet's finite fossil fuels. Wind farms spun across the plains. The wind that once carried ash and death now turned turbines, providing light and heat to restored homes. In the 150th year, the population reached 200 million. A small number for the planet, but stable, controlled, living in balance with renewed and precious resources. Culture became planetary. Nationalities mixed in the domes, languages merged into a new lingua franca, and borders lost their meaning in the face of common survival and destiny. Religion transformed into a philosophy of respect for life. Temples were built in forests, prayers were offered in gratitude to the air, water, and earth, the elements that sustain existence. Education became the top priority. Every child studied the history of the catastrophe, the biology of recovery, and sustainability technologies. Knowledge was a weapon against the repetition of horror. An open-air museum was created in Siberia. The frozen cities of the time of the catastrophe were preserved as a monument so that future generations could see the price of human carelessness and arrogance. Children were taken on tours of the dead streets. They saw the remains of cars, frozen fountains, and the skeletons of buildings. Ghosts of a world that had forgotten that nature does not forgive mistakes. In the 200th year, the sky was blue most of the year. The clouds of ash became a legend told by the elderly, which the young listened to with disbelief and interest. The temperature stabilized at +15 in summer and -5 in winter. A new norm, colder than the old world, but sufficient for a diverse and sustainable life. The oceans came back to life. Fish swam in clean water, whales sang in the depths, coral reefs grew slowly in new places, farther from the equator than before. Humanity learned to live with the planet, not on the planet. Balance was found through suffering, the death of billions, a century of darkness and eternal terrible cold. The new civilization was wiser than the old. It remembered the ash-filled sky, knew the value of air, and cherished every ray of sunshine as a gift, not as something taken for granted by nature. Children played under the blue sky, unaware that it had once been gray. It was the goal of those who had survived the catastrophe to ensure that the nightmare remained in the past, in the lesson, in the memory. The story of the ash-gray sky became a founding myth. From death came life. From darkness came light. From ashes came a phoenix that would never again allow itself to be consumed by its own fire. And the sky was blue, and the sun was yellow, and the air was clean, and people breathed deeply, remembering those who had suffocated so that they could breathe freely now.